welcome everybody to tonight's talk. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which of course was established in memory of the late British historian. We're a charity. We aim to be a bridge between the world of research and a broad public, and we really rely on donations so that we can keep all of our events free at the point of access and reach as wide an audience as possible. So any contributions are always very gratefully received. It's very easy to donate on our website. As many of you will know, Sir Martin's work was focused on the 20th century, and his particular skill was to find very engaging ways of making that history accessible to wide audiences. And so in an effort to preserve that legacy, our focus at the center is always to be, as I said, a bridge between research and the public, to find engaging ways of bringing the most rigorous and most up-to-date research to the public and to make it accessible. And today's topic, I think, fits that bill particularly well. In today's talk, we're going to hear about a study of Jews in South Africa, which some of you may well be familiar with, that was conducted in 2019 under the auspices of the Isaac and Jessie Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town, together with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in the UK. That study is the latest of a number of surveys that were carried out of the community, but it's the largest and the most extensive that's been carried out to date. It's full of complicated, fascinating findings about this relatively small but very dynamic community at the tip of Africa. And I'm really, really pleased that we have here with us to interpret and translate some of that research for us, Adam Mendelson, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Cape Town and also the Director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies. Adam is, in addition to being the director of the center, an eminent scholar in his own right of modern Jewish history. His first book was titled The Rag Race: How Jews Sowed Their Way to Success in America and the British Empire. That was published in 2014, and he has a forthcoming book which looks fascinating, titled Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. And hopefully we'll be able to get him back to tell you more about that, either later this calendar year or early next. I believe it's out in the autumn. Is that right, Adam? So we're all very excited to hear about that, but today we are particularly excited to hear about the survey. Adam will speak for about 40 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor up for your questions and comments. You can either post those questions in the chat to everyone or privately to me, or you'll be able to put your hand up and ask those questions afterwards. So Adam's talk is titled What's in Store for the Jewish Community in South Africa. Adam, I'm going to post a few small things in the chat, including information about your book, and then I'm handing over to you.
Great, thank you, Shirley. Thank you for that introduction, and good evening and welcome to everyone. I should warn you that the sound you hear in the background here is all the sounds of a Cape Town winter's day. Those of you feeling nostalgic, missing Cape Town, it's absolutely pouring outside. So with some rain drumming against my windows, against the roof. So I apologize for that. So as Shirley mentioned, I direct the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town. And as she described, the center has conducted a series of surveys of the South African Jewish population, really dating back to the first proper survey or full-scale survey was in 1991, but there's some earlier surveys as well. And we've conducted these, there's a 1995 survey, 1998, 2005, and then this most recent survey in 2019. And all of these were designed to provide a snapshot of the Jewish community at particular moments in time and to track trends in a variety of different areas. So what changes in demography, changes in Jewish identity, education and religion, et cetera, et cetera. The most recent survey was in 2019 in partnership with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, JPR, and really provides a number of indications of where the South African Jewish community is headed. This evening, I'm going to try and put some of these findings into a larger historical perspective. I'm actually going to draw upon some of the findings from the earlier surveys to give you a sense of how things have changed. And there are a whole range of fascinating changes in a relatively short space of time within the community which for a long period of time looked like that was relatively stable in terms of its internal dynamics, in terms of its a variety of trends, has undergone a period of dramatic change, really in the space of the last 2 decades. As you'll see, I'm only going to scratch the surface here, though. If those of you interested in understanding more about the South African Jewish community, I'd recommend that you take a look at the survey report, which is available on the Kaplan Center website, and it's a very readable document with lots of lovely charts and graphs, and worth taking a look at. So my goal this evening is twofold. Firstly, I'm going to identify some of these trends, which I think are particularly striking. And secondly, I'm going to talk about some of the potential long-term ramifications of these trends. That is, what do they potentially indicate about the future of the South African Jewish community? And you'll see I'll pick out a variety of elements which I think are quite revealing. The first and most obvious trend that I'll point to relates to demographics, the demographics of the South African Jewish population. And Shirley, let's, if you'll load the slides, that'd be great. We can actually go to the first slide is of the cover of our report, but the second slide is the one which we should start with, which shows you our estimate of the population, of the South African Jewish population. We estimated, and this is again data as Shirley described, which the survey itself was done in 2019. The report came out in 2020, so just prior to COVID. We estimated then that the South African Jewish population was just over 52,000, with around 30,000 living in Johannesburg, followed by Cape Town with about 12,500 and Durban with about 3,400 Jews living there. And this estimate was not particularly popular among some leaders of the South African Jewish population. In fact, we got quite a lot of pushback against this estimate. Why was it so unpopular? Well, the community, by our estimate, is now less than half the size that it was in the early 1970s, when it probably exceeded about 120,000. So in the space of, in other words, 50 years, a community of 120,000 is now a community probably close to 52,000 and probably even smaller since 2019. Moreover, it's less than half the size of the Australian Jewish population, a community that until relatively recently was significantly smaller than the South African Jewish population. And there's this long rivalry between South Africa and Australia in a variety of ways, and this doesn't help the ego of South African Jews. More importantly, we are probably not far off falling below 50,000, a psychologically significant milestone, a community which will be smaller than 50,000 and will only, I suspect, continue to shrink in size over time. But to me, this number is unsurprising and not particularly interesting, because this decline has been underway for decades. Again, every survey we've done since 1991 has indicated this process of shrinking within the community. And much of it is an effect of emigration, which I'll talk about in some detail, and also of aging within the community. That when we last did the survey in 2005, the community we estimated probably around 69,000. So since 2005, so just under 15 years, the community went from 69,000 to 52,000, a significant drop. As I said, it's largely because of significant immigration from South Africa. So there's little surprise, though, as I said, in terms of this decline. This has been underway for decades, really, substantially since the 1970s. It reveals, as I said, what we already knew, that this community is smaller than it was when we last did the survey, and is likely to continue to get smaller over time. The good news is that South Africa remains the 11th largest Jewish population by country in the world. The bad news is that the same pattern holds true for many other Jewish communities internationally. Many of our peer communities have shrunk too. In fact, the South African Jewish population will stay at number 11 because the next in line are Ukraine and Hungary. What the pattern we see in South Africa speaks to is the latter stages of a fundamental change in Jewish demography. A once dispersed and truly global people has become a people concentrated in a handful of countries. Only 5 countries around the world have more than 200,000 Jews. Only 2 countries have more than 500,000 Jews. And this is a completely different picture, even since the Holocaust. So what do our numbers tell us about the direction that South African Jewry is headed? As I've said to you already, clearly the population is shrinking over time, but what else do our numbers suggest? Well, the median age is 45, which is old in comparison with, very old, in fact, in comparison with the median age of the general South African population. South Africa is a very young population. The median age of the general population is around 26. The median age of the Jewish population is around 45. So you can see it's a relatively older population. But much like the national Jewish population figure, focusing on this national number alone conceals more than it reveals. And this is what a theme I'll return to again and again this evening, is how the picture is more complicated when you look actually city by city. There are very different dynamics at work internally within different centers of South African Jewish life. Likewise, if you place these numbers in comparison internationally, the picture looks somewhat different. Because, for example, the median age of the Jewish population of South Africa is only 1 year older than that of the Australian Jewish population, for example. That community has grown because of immigration, but at the same time, it's also, at its core, is an older population too. Let's go on to the next slide, which again suggests a pattern which has distinctive South African features, but is not unique to the South African Jewish population. This is a population pyramid of the South African Jewish population. You can see here that it is, again, a top-heavy population pyramid. It's an aging demographic profile that is typical of many diaspora Jewish communities. What is interesting here, though, of course, is that if you look particularly amongst those in their 30s and 40s and 50s, that there's that the pyramid is missing a part of its shape, and that's again the effect of immigration. But we need to look beyond the surface here too. Looking at the median age of the entire South African Jewish population in this undifferentiated way is problematic, as I've already suggested to you. What is more revealing is we look at these different population centers. We look at Cape Town and Johannesburg and Durban, we see how they are moving in different directions. Remember that Johannesburg has the largest Jewish population. Johannesburg has a Jewish population of around 30,000, Cape Town a Jewish population around 12,500, Durban around 3,500. Not only are the Jewish populations in Cape Town and Durban significantly smaller than Johannesburg, but the median age in the two coastal cities is significantly higher than in Johannesburg. So if the national median age is 45, in Cape Town it is 52, and even higher in Durban. Only 7% of Durban's Jewish population are aged between 18 and 40. In Cape Town, it's 16%. By contrast, in Johannesburg, it's 30%. 30% of Jews are aged between 18 and 40. So in other words, that's a prime age at which people are getting married and having families. You can see how Cape Town, and particularly Durban, they are older populations with fewer younger people. What this means is that the Johannesburg community has a reality that is different from Cape Town and Durban. It's less top-heavy and more likely to naturally replenish itself than are Cape Town and certainly Durban. So in other words, we do better to invest less in thinking of the national Jewish population than of Jewish populations, of Jewish communities, than of a single Jewish community in South Africa, with different communities pulling and pointing in different directions. And you'll see that this is reinforced when we talk about other themes as well, when we talk about religion in particular, and how this plays out very differently. Religious identity manifests very differently in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. If Cape Town and Durban need to worry about a population that will naturally decline in size over time, in other words, this older population in Cape Town and Durban, Jews in Johannesburg are more likely to say they want to immigrate than do Jews in Cape Town in particular. And this is another of the data points from the survey that has received a lot of attention. I'll show you this in the next slide. This again, this figure in particular, in the next slide is one which also received a lot of attention when we released it. Our study found that 43% of Jews in South Africa say they have considered leaving South Africa permanently in the previous year. So in other words, we conducted the survey in 2019. In the previous year, 43% had thought about immigrating, thought about leaving South Africa. On the face of it, this is a shocking figure. 43% of South African Jews have given some thought to leaving the country. And this actually looks even worse when you divide this by age. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see that those in their 20s and 30s in particular are more likely to say they want to leave South Africa. So again, suggesting that the younger population, those that the community ultimately rely on to replenish itself, to support communal institutions, etc., they are the very people who say they're most likely to want to immigrate. But again, we need to place this into a longer perspective. In 1998, one of our previous surveys, a very similar percentage, 41% of South African Jews then said the same thing, that they wanted that they had considered leaving South Africa in the previous year. But what's striking about that 1998 figure is that the rate of immigration actually declined in following years rather than increased. So this question, in other words, about wanting to immigrate has some predictive power, but is more useful as a reflection of sentiment towards South Africa, what people feel about South Africa at a particular moment in time. What our data about immigration reveals is a very, very negative mood in South Africa at the moment, exacerbated less by problems specific to Jews. For example, anti-Semitism is a marginal phenomenon in South Africa today, than by South Africa's profound challenges. So to me, these numbers, this very significant percentage of the population would say that they've thought about leaving. What this suggests is that they already are deeply troubled by the sense of where South Africa is at the moment. These problems are familiar, I suspect, to many of you. Very, very high rates of crime and unemployment, rampant government corruption, which certainly became much worse under the Jacob Zuma administration, and the failure of basic government services, including a now unreliable electricity supply. In Johannesburg, some of these issues are more acute than Cape Town, which has been somewhat insulated from at least some of these problems. But why is the mood so bad now? And because most of these problems are not new. In fact, the crime, particularly in the post-1994 period, was perhaps worse than it is today in some ways. Paradoxically, the particularly negative mood in South Africa may reflect the way in which the extent of these problems have been recently aired at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. For those of you who haven't been following this, are unaware of this, that after Jacob Zuma was deposed or resigned from office as president, we've had a long-running commission of inquiry into corruption in his administration, and almost on a weekly basis, there have been revelations about the extent of corruption, extraordinary extent of corruption under during his period of governance. And while we knew these problems were severe, few can now delude themselves that they're likely to be resolved soon. In fact, it's been a parade, as I've described, of awful tidings about just how bad things were under the Zuma government. And the sense of crisis is reflected too in the political sphere, with the African National Congress, the ANC, clearly having lost its grip on the electorate, that its electoral fortunes have been in serious decline over the last number of years. And you see this reflected both in terms of the souring of the national political mood, but also, for example, at the University of Cape Town campus amongst my students, where it's now become fashionable to identify South Africa's malaise, our general economic and political crisis, as a consequence of constitutional democracy itself. This loss of faith in democracy, particularly amongst young South Africans, is a very disturbing trend to see, and something which has now become a standard for young students to mouth these sentiments, saying that democracy is not perhaps such a good thing. And disturbingly as well, we often hear, it's become a standard practice to hear how Nelson Mandela sold out Black South Africans in the negotiations of the transitional power in the early 1990s. And increasing numbers of particularly young people calling for more radical, less democratic options in South Africa. So again, it's whether this is something which is a passing fancy or not is uncertain, but certainly is very troubling, obviously, to many South Africans, particularly those who are deeply committed to the constitutional project. So all these factors have focused the minds of South Africans and of South African Jews. But it's, again, there's more to this than the numbers can tell us. Let's go to the next slide, because in addition to asking our respondents about whether they had considered leaving, we also asked them about whether they were likely to immigrate over the next 5 years. So we previously, the question I discussed with you 43% said that they had thought about leaving over the previous year. Now this is a question about action. How many people are likely to actually immigrate, or at least claim that they're likely to immigrate over the next 5 years? So this is, as I said, this is a question not about idle thoughts, but about actual action, concrete action. And 15% of those we polled, a very considerable number, indicated that they are likely to leave South Africa over the next 5 years. And this, of course, is not a perfect predictor of behavior. This is, again, a reflection of sentiment, but perhaps more than just sentiment. Perhaps people have actually made inquiries, have begun the practical process of planning for departure. Actual rates of immigration, of course, go up and down. They go up and they come down dramatically as well. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is inevitable, that 15% of the community will leave over the next 5 years. Again, think back to those figures from 1998, which again predicted dramatic numbers of South African Jews departing. That did not come to pass. In fact, immigration rates slowed over the next period. But as I said, what I think this really reflects is that this acts as it demonstrates or serves as a barometer of sentiment about South Africa, rather than a demonstration of concrete action, but certainly should be worrying for those who need to think about sustaining Jewish infrastructure in South Africa over the next number of years. What has changed over the last 2 decades is the preferred destination of those who say they want to immigrate. In our previous survey, Australia was by far the preferred destination for those saying they wanted to leave South Africa. It was trailed by the UK, trailed by particularly the US. Israel typically lagged far behind. This was not the preferred destination. People who said they wanted to immigrate wanted to go to Australia. But what's fascinating about our new study is how the preferences have flipped dramatically over the last 15 years. Now, 51% of those who say they are likely to leave say they want to go to Israel. And it's now trailed distantly by Australia and the US. In fact, almost a third of those who we asked about their future plans, this is of the total South African Jewish population we asked about their future plans, almost a third said they would like to settle in Israel at some future point in time. So again, there's sort of something's happening relating to Israel, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, sort of attitudes towards Israel. There's again, one of these interesting changes which is taking place among South African Jews. We've actually already seen this borne out over the last few years, that rates of those making Aliyah have skyrocketed to the point that the agency responsible for preparing immigrants for Aliyah took the highly unusual step of publicly reminding the South African Jewish community of how challenging adaptation to Israel is. In other words, trying to discourage people in a way from being too hasty in wanting to move to Israel. And this was last year. There was in a way a push for realism from the very people who otherwise encourage immigrants to make Aliyah. Israel's growing appeal to South African immigrants reflects, I think, in part the perceived generosity of Aliyah benefits, as well as the fact that alternatives, including the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, are increasingly difficult to get into. But also it might reflect changes within the South African Jewish population, particularly changes within Johannesburg, which I'll talk about in detail in a short while. There's several other interesting findings in our study that interrelate with the immigration issue. I'll speak briefly about several of these, as they also point to changes in the profile of immigrants and of the South African Jewish population. One of the most striking trends since 1998 is the degree to which the community has on average become better educated. In a little more than 20 years, the percentage of the Jewish population that has a university degree has almost doubled. In 1998, 35% of the total Jewish population had university qualifications. In 2019, 59% held a bachelor's degree or above. Moreover, amongst those aged between 30 and 39, the figure rises to 76%. So you can see in a relatively short space of time. Again, it's the reasons for this, which I can talk about in the question and answer time if you're interested. You can see how the educational profile of the community has shifted quite dramatically. And this again has implications for immigration. University education advantages Jews for immigration to countries with merit and points-based immigration systems, and makes them more competitive internationally for employment. But also, of course, has implications for those who stay in South Africa as well, and for their earning power and their place in South African society. To be university educated in South Africa is to be a part of the elite. Other findings relating to education are equally striking. Already in 1998, 3/4 of school-age Jews were attending Jewish day schools. And you'll see this actually in the next slide as well, how this has held steady. This population is not very much different from 1998. So today, 75% of Jews of school-age Jews attend the Jewish day school. Shelley, if you show us the next slide, you'll see this. We'll see this absolutely. That so it's held steady since 1998. At a very, very high rate of attendance of Jewish day schools in South Africa. But the difference is in that 1998, this was a relatively new phenomenon that had accelerated in the preceding decade because of the perceived decline of government schools and other related factors. In other words, there's a flight from public schools, particularly in Johannesburg, but elsewhere too, where which pushed up the rate of attendance of Jewish day schools, particularly in the 1990s. The parents of children who went to Jewish schools in 1998 were much more likely to have themselves gone to government schools than parents with children in Jewish day schools today. So there's an interesting generational shift which has taken place. Those who were kids in the 1990s are now adults. That cohort and the ones that followed are now in their 20s, 30s, and 40s and have children of their own at Jewish day schools. In other words, the proportion of the Jewish population that has gone to Jewish day schools is now much, much higher than in 1998. And you'll see that this has, at least I believe, has a variety of consequences for the identity of the community. What are these long-term consequences been? What are the long-term effects of this very high rate since the 1990s of attendance of Jewish day schools? Well, for example, one of the changes has been a much higher percentage of the community claims to be able to speak Hebrew. And this is reflected in other forms of attachment to Israel, for example, as well. You'll see this in the next slide, that self-reported attachment to Israel has actually increased significantly since 1998. So a stronger sense of attachment since our 1998 survey. We obviously can't ascribe this trend to education alone. This is not just about more people going to Jewish day schools, but there's strong evidence that changes in schooling have had a significant influence on the sense of attachment to Israel. And this is a surprising finding. I would have expected that attachment to Israel might have actually at least plateaued or declined since 1998, but instead we actually see it strengthening. One of the reasons it's surprising is that the general climate in South Africa has actually become increasingly hostile to Israel and Zionism. Particularly with the very vigorous BDS movement, boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in South Africa. We might expect that Jewish attachment to Israel might have declined over the last 2 decades. Instead, we see the opposite. And I think that, in fact, there probably is an interrelationship with Jews in a way feeling embattled. Those who feel attachment to Israel have responded to actually strengthening their attachment to Israel rather than the sense of attachment weakening over time. We also probably see a similar impact of this high rate of attendance of Jewish day schools in the intermarriage rate. And we'll see this in the next slide. This is the high rate of attendance of Jewish day schools has likely contributed to keeping the intermarriage rate relatively low over the past 2 decades. It's been consistently lower than our peer communities and has not risen significantly over the past 2 decades. So this might suggest, as I'm suggesting to you, that school choice is important, has had a variety of influences on the community. And as I described to you, as I suggested to you, changes in school-going patterns were driven because of white flight from public schools, particularly in Johannesburg, particularly in the 1990s. So it's not something which is necessarily driven by the community itself. Instead, it's responding to a sense of the changing dynamics of South African society. School choice and this higher rate of attendance of Jewish schools has also influenced religious trends as well. There's strong evidence in our data of something that is widely recognized for those of you who know South Africa, particularly the Johannesburg community, is that the community has resorted itself in significant ways when it comes to religion. And we see this in both belief and in terms of affiliation. And I'll start with talking briefly about the signs of changing belief amongst South African Jews. In 1998 and 2005, for example, in our surveys, 36% of Jews agreed that the Torah is the actual word of God. So 36% said the Torah is Sinai, is the word of God. But in 2019, it goes from 36% to 58%, now saying that the Torah is the word of God. And we see the opposite happening with those who say that the Torah is inspired by God, but not necessarily the actual word of God. That number goes from 41% in 1998 to 14% today. So in other words, a much higher percentage believing that the Torah is the actual word of God. And this is, as I said, is a demonstration of shifts in belief, an indicator of trends, which I'll talk about now. These trends have certainly been visible for more than 2 decades. On the one hand, parts of the community have become more orthodox in observance and affiliation, particularly in Johannesburg. So, for example, in 1998, 2005, about 14% of Jews describe themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox. Today, 38% do so, a much higher rate, more than doubling of those who describe themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox. On the other hand, those who are not Orthodox are trending in the opposite direction. So as part of this phenomenon, the self-description that was most popular in our previous surveys, most popular in our surveys in the 1990s and in 2005, the most popular self-definition was traditional. So African Jews used to like to describe themselves as traditional. And 2/3 consistently describe themselves as being traditional. Today, less than 1/3 describe themselves as traditional. So we've seen a collapse of that middle category and instead polarization, with increasing number describing themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox, and others who are moving away from a traditional self-definition, moving further towards describing themselves as secular or cultural Jews, or as progressive, joining the progressive movement. But this is only part of the story. For not only has this category of traditional collapsed, really this what had been a dominant category, dominant way of South African Jews thinking about themselves, this has really begun to disappear. But in real terms, the community is much more polarized in terms of everyday practice and observance. So again, our earlier surveys found very, very high rates of, for example, fasting on Yom Kippur and attending a Passover Seder and participating in Shabbat dinners. And the numbers have fallen significantly just over the last 2 decades. So again, on the one hand, a significant portion of the population becoming more Orthodox, but then a significant percentage becoming less observant in a variety of ways as well. In aggregate, in fact, the community has become less observant overall. And we see this too in terms of the percentage of the population who say that they go regularly to synagogue, go regularly to shul, that again has been in decline over the last 2 decades. So this is a paradox, a simultaneous rise and decline in religiosity in different parts of the community. And it's all part of a complicated process. The percentage of Jews that describe themselves as secular remains largely unchanged, and those who identify with the progressive movement has grown. What is really happening is that what used to be referred as the South African style of orthodoxy, that is a largely non-observant orthodoxy that nonetheless retained attachment to tradition, is rapidly falling away. And the result is that a segment of the community that is, the results will be now the segment of the community that is much more orthodox, but the rest are much less orthodox on average than they used to be. But again, as I suggested to you, looking only at the national numbers is misleading. And surely let's go to the next slide where we'll see this again borne out. This is as true of religion as it is of demographics. Note how in this graph over here, how younger Jews are significantly more likely to describe themselves as religious than their grandparents. Even more striking is what happens if we compare what has been happening in the 3 cities, in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban. It's not just a picture in terms of age, that younger Jews are more likely to be observant or to be Orthodox than their grandparents, or to identify in that way. It's also very much a picture of geography. Let's go to the next slide where we'll see this. Jews in Johannesburg are much more likely to answer questions about belief. There we go, this one, yeah, thanks, Shirley. More likely to answer questions about belief and identity affirmatively than are Jews in Cape Town, for example. Note, for example, on the slide how orthodoxy dominates in Johannesburg. 48% of Jews in Johannesburg describe themselves in one way or another as Orthodox. In Cape Town, by contrast, 22% describe themselves as Orthodox. And you can see Cape Town and Durban follow a similar pattern. The overall effect is a strikingly different balance in each city, with trends moving in opposite directions in Cape Town and Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, a move towards greater identification over time with orthodoxy, and the shrinking of the traditional category is in large extent people becoming orthodox, some moving towards a more secular forms of identity, or describing themselves as cultural Jews, but a clear move to the right in Johannesburg religiously, whereas Cape Town and Durban, we see the opposite trend, where the traditional category instead, it is also shrinking, but increasing numbers identifying instead as particularly as cultural Jews, as secular things of that kind. And again, not the equivalent growth of an Orthodox identity in Cape Town and Durban as in Johannesburg. And as I said, the overall effect is a strikingly different balance in each city, with trends moving in opposite directions in different places. And we'll see this again in the next slide. What this again points to is communities rather than community. The South African Jewish population is undergoing a period of polarization and resorting that is undoing the old middle-of-the-road consensus that used to dominate. To me, this divergence in age profile and religious identity in these different cities heralds a period of tension as these communities pull in different directions. And this is not an entirely new story. Those of you who know the history of South African Jewry know that there have always been tensions, long been tensions between Cape Town and Johannesburg, for example, as well as within the Jewish communities of each of these cities. This, however, is not only a story of geography. It's a story, as I said, of we're going to see, to my mind, an acceleration or an accentuation of tensions between these cities and within these cities. Because it's also a story of polarization within Johannesburg and Cape Town, as parts of the community become more orthodox and others drift in the opposite direction. Contemporary politics in the UK and in America demonstrates that polarization makes for nasty arguments and the collapse of consensus. And we have already seen in South African Jewry a variety of intracommunal arguments over a variety of matters, for example, the singing of women at public functions and other such matters over the last number of years. And I think they're all symptomatic of this increasing polarization within the community. And these arguments might not necessarily be a bad thing, but they do put pressure on any notion of a unified South African Jewish community. Polarization also makes that much more challenging for the community to find common cause and to respond effectively to future challenges, some of which are apparent to you, or should be apparent to you from my discussion of demographics and immigration. I'll end by drawing your attention to a very different theme that is unfortunately also relevant to the present. And this relates to the economic profile of the community. For a variety of reasons, the South African community has a strikingly high rate of self-employment. In 2019, for example, roughly, actually over a quarter of the community was self-employed. And this has never been a source of concern until now. In fact, the opposite has been a source of pride, a sense of this is an entrepreneurial community which has largely supported itself in a variety of ways in South Africa. It supports a whole array of communal institutions. Likewise, there's been a sense that self-employment has insulated the community from the effects of affirmative action, that people don't naturally think about government service or other forms of employment in, for example, large corporates where affirmative action policies might be particularly restrictive. Instead, self-employment has always been seen as a viable option, lots of opportunity for people to start their own businesses in South Africa. But given the current economic crisis in South Africa, which has been accentuated by the pandemic, this high rate of self-employment is suddenly a matter of great concern, as of course is the top-heavy age profile of the community. The pandemic, with its related economic and travel restrictions, hit independent small businesses particularly hard. Already there are signs that the community will be a very different place financially in future than it was pre-pandemic. We are hoping for a recovery, but again, much of this is interconnected with the general economic crisis within South Africa. What is equally uncertain is what the pandemic means for immigration. Because of restrictions on travel, immigration slowed dramatically over the last 2 years, but will it accelerate again? On the one hand, fewer people may have the means to leave, again, relating to the economic crisis I've described to you within South Africa. Excluding Israel, several countries that were formerly preferred destinations of South African Jews, like Australia and the US, may not be open to immigrants as well, or less receptive of immigrants, certainly. On the other hand, more Jews may need to leave if South Africa's economic and political crisis continues and perhaps worsens. All this points to something you already know. There's never a dull moment in South Africa, and no end, by the way, to moments in South African history in the recent past where the doomsayers have been very, very loud, and where South Africa has defied predictions, dire predictions about its future. But I suspect, however, that we really are in a hinge moment for South Africa and for its Jews. If I was to give this talk again in 2030, I suspect the longer term future of the community will be that much clearer, as will the future of South Africa itself. As I joked when I spoke a couple of years ago, to an Australian audience, maybe we'll all be in Sydney by then. Or as the data I described to you earlier suggests, perhaps more likely we'll all be in Israel by then. But to end, perhaps the best news for you all is that historians are notoriously bad at prophecy. I'd certainly be very happy to be wrong about everything that I've described to you this evening. The good news is that we'll all get to see what happens. So if Shirley agrees, I'll be happy to return in 2030 to discuss how much we got right and hopefully how much I got wrong. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you for committing to coming back in 8 years' time. We would all look forward to that. And thank you for taking us through what is, as you said, a remarkably rich and complex set of findings and beginning to guide us through some of the most striking aspects of those findings. I can see that a couple of comments have come through in the chat, which I will look through when I stop speaking. And I also have some questions of my own. I wonder if anybody wants to put their hands up immediately. Maybe I'll just ask the first question that has been posed to me in the chat, which is asking, jumping straight into one of the difficult questions, what position has the organized Jewish community taken vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Do younger Jewish South Africans share their parents' perspectives? Are there initiatives looking to bring South Africans of Jewish heritage together with South Africans of Palestinian heritage, whether Christian or Muslim?
Great questions. So questions about attitudes towards Israel, particularly amongst young people. And again, in a different version of this talk, I've pointed to exactly this, that one of the interesting changes, perhaps too soon to tell, which I've noticed in the data, is that particularly amongst younger Jews, there are still very, very high rates of attachment to Israel. And again, high rates in comparison with our peer communities as well. It's strikingly high rates of attachment to Israel, but a clear indication that younger Jews feel differently from their grandparents about Israel, or at least that a significant percentage feel differently about Israel than do their grandparents. So and some of that might just be a reflection of age, that younger people are more likely to hold oppositional views or views which would, in some cases, might be regarded as rebellious. Perhaps some of that. Some of it might be generational, that older people who remember a different Israel just feel differently from younger Jews about Israel. But again, my sense is that we might be seeing the first signs of catch-up here amongst younger Jews in particular towards trends which a number of observers have noted in America and elsewhere over the last number of decades, where there is a phenomenon amongst younger Jews that a fair percentage, a significant percentage, don't share their parents' and grandparents' views of Israel. So we might be seeing catch-up. And the reason I think there might be something to that is a number of the trends which I spoke about this evening are already catch-up trends, that a community which was once guided by a certain dominant consensus has polarized. And I think that that's indicative of Jewish communities elsewhere that we're a few decades behind, perhaps in South Africa. And I think that maybe on Israel, we're seeing the same thing. Certainly what I also, though, I should qualify this by saying as well that the key Commonwealth institutions, for the most part, toe a very particular line on Israel, and that there's a consensus, and certainly I think amongst most Commonwealth leaders of quite fierce support for Israel. That the South African Zionist Federation is very effective, or certainly very loud in promoting its views, which tend to be a right of center view on Israel matters. There are some alternatives within the community, some which are centrist and some of which are further to the left. And interesting, one of the phenomenon which has been striking over the last number of decades, and perhaps has echoes in earlier behaviors of younger Jews in opposition to their views of their parents when it came to apartheid, perhaps, is that we do see defection in the sense of a number of quite prominent younger Jews who in some cases were members of Jewish youth movements who have washed their hands of the community over Israel and have in some cases become quite prominent advocates of variations on the BDS movements, so Jewish Voices for Peace or otherwise. So there is that phenomenon. Again, it's very difficult to quantify, and certainly it's generated significant contestation within the community. That's particularly around, for example, Limud. There was an episode now several years ago where Limud was pressured and ultimately gave in to pressure to disinvite young Jews who were associated with more left-wing approaches to Israel from participating. So again, that gives you some indication of power dynamics within the community, but also sentiment towards Israel within the community as well. So it's really a sensitive subject, Israel. And on the one hand, it's something which is to a significant portion of the community is a unifying factor, but I think to others, it's also one where it leads to alienation as well.
Thanks. I'm really struck by this theme of unity. I mean, anyone who's read the historiography of South African Jews will know that the narrative of unity, this narrative of a homogeneous community, of a unified community, has always been really important to South African Jews. And it's very interesting, hearing your comments now against the backdrop of what you were talking about earlier, which is a community that really is in very objective terms, in particular areas, polarizing. It's very much not a unified community, and yet in a way those narratives of unity are stronger and stronger, and it's just probably not coincidental that those things are happening.
And just to add a word to what you said is that unity and unified community, if you listen to the chief rabbi, the Orthodox chief rabbi Warren Goldstein, that this claim of a unified community is one of the most common claims. I suspect your explanation is entirely correct, that there's a inverse relationship between polarization and claims of unity. And the need to
exactly. Yeah. Okay, lots of really fascinating questions coming to me. And I should say that at 11 minutes to 8, it's possible we won't get to all of them, but do nonetheless keep them coming, and maybe I'll put them to Adam in a group. They're covering really quite different terrain. But let me start with this one from Marilyn, who says there's talk of semigration from Johannesburg to Cape Town, which is very popular with young people. How does this perhaps explain young Jewish demographics?
A great question. So the great hope of the Cape Town community in particular, and prior to that, actually, the Durban community, was semigration. This would solve the demographic crisis in Cape Town, that there'd be young Jews would come to Cape Town, or families would move to Cape Town. We did a separate study of the Cape Town community at roughly the same time that we did this national survey, and we're looking specifically for data on semigration. Semigration has not, so semigration basically, for those of you who don't know the term, would mean Jews decamping from Johannesburg and moving to Cape Town or Durban elsewhere. In essence, we see little sign of it, or at least a relatively small number of families moving to Cape Town. Instead, I think that we see some of the opposite actually as well, that young Jews in particular are drawn to Johannesburg. The sense of Johannesburg as a place, particularly if you're religious or you're drawn towards religion, is a place which is far more dynamic. There are far more other young people around, and so young Jews post-university moving to Johannesburg, again, it's interconnected with the sense that there are more economic opportunities in Johannesburg as well, and that Johannesburg is away from family and all those sort of things. So I think that we see both the some movement of people from Johannesburg, but also particularly young people moving to Johannesburg as well. The other phenomenon which has been identified more recently is a different sort of migration from Johannesburg, which is, for example, moving, those of you who know South Africa well, a substantial number, I think relatively substantial number of people moving, for example, to Plettenberg Bay and other from Johannesburg. And again, some of this has in fact been, I think, accelerated and facilitated by COVID, the sense that you can, in fact, work online and you can live in Plettenberg Bay, enjoy all the wonders of the coast, etc., and not have to live in Johannesburg, but still, be surrounded by other Jews from Johannesburg and sort of have a like-minded community, for example, in Plettenberg Bay. So again, there are all sorts of subterranean phenomena of this kind going on as well.
Thanks. So to take us in quite a different direction, this I thought was an interesting question, which was asking for information on where candidates for the South African rabbinate study. Are women now serving as rabbis in South Africa through the Maharat for Orthodox women? Is there ordination in conservative and reform or reconstructionist seminaries rather?
Okay, great question. So South African Jewry is dominated by, in terms of religious practice, is dominated by the Orthodox and the progressive movement. And for a variety of reasons, the conservative movement really didn't ever catch on entirely. We have now female rabbis in Cape Town and Johannesburg who serve progressive congregations. That's also a relatively recent phenomenon, which is interesting in itself. But within Orthodoxy in South Africa, it's there've been interesting changes in the rabbinate. Certainly, I wouldn't hold my breath, wouldn't take a wager that there's likely to be a female rabbi serving an Orthodox congregation anytime soon. In fact, I suspect the community is becoming less likely over time that's a possibility. And some of this reflects that trend I spoke about in Johannesburg of the community moving rightward in particular. But also the other phenomenon here connects with a deeper trend within the rabbinate in South Africa. Whereas in the past, when the South African currency, when the rand was stronger, there was more recruitment of rabbis from abroad. Some Israelis, some Americans, some from the UK and elsewhere. That trend has perhaps somewhat declined, as I said, with the weakness of the currency plus South Africa's economic challenges. Those who have come tend to be affiliated with Chabad Lubavitch or other sort of outreach movements of that kind, so also Meach and things of that kind. And again, they've somewhat changed over time the character of the Johannesburg Jewish community, those rabbis who did come from abroad. But the historically relatively new phenomenon is this training of South African rabbis, particularly in yeshivot in Johannesburg. And now a number of pulpits in South Africa are filled by South African born and Orthodox rabbis. And again, often, not always, but often with Chabad Lubavitch backgrounds. Again, and there's an interesting phenomenon, I think, going on there. I don't think it's accidental. I think it's because they can often relate to congregations where the membership is still, in a place like Cape Town, for example, still closer towards that sort of old traditional style that I described, and that a Chabad rabbi is better able to speak to that sort of congregant. But the rabbinate, in fact, there's an oversupply now of rabbis in South Africa, but they're more likely to be South African trained, and again, with a shrinking community, not that this is high up on the list of problems that the community faces, but there is an interesting issue here of the attractiveness of the rabbinate and too few congregations to fill. In fact, this is a sort of problem we wish we would really be dealing with over the next number of years.
Thank you. David asks a question, which I'm going to amplify a little bit, and hopefully, David, I will get right the thrust of your question. But he asks about the affiliation of Jews to South Africa and migration of Jews to South Africa. And I see in that a question of what is Jews' relationship to the country, I would say probably particularly post-apartheid. And if I might add my own question to that, which is related to your discussion about education. And the fact that 3/4 of young Jews are in day schools, and probably their parents were in Jewish day schools. And it strikes me that that's a very interesting space in contemporary South Africa, because there are white spaces they're largely white spaces, which are comparatively rare in South African education. So to what extent that also feeds into Jews' sense of connectedness to South Africa versus not?
These are great questions. I mean, I'll start with the easy one about migration to South Africa, that particularly in the 1980s, a quite significant number of Israelis moved to South Africa, and again, drawn by economic opportunity. One of as I said, barometers also of the current state of the South African economy is that immigration of Israelis in particular, I think has all but ceased, and I think some Israelis have left. And again, these are Israelis who are looking for opportunity and would find it not necessarily become actively involved in the community, the Jewish community, but would be drawn to South Africa. Otherwise, I don't think there is significant sort of in-migration of Jews from elsewhere. Certainly in the past there was, that the Jews from, as countries decolonized elsewhere in Africa, we would see, those coming from the then Belgium Congo or the then Rhodesia or otherwise to South Africa. That phenomenon has all but ceased. So not much in the way of in-migration, certainly plenty of Jews leaving South Africa. And that immigration, by the way, it's not just a Jewish phenomenon, its decline in terms of beyond Africa. There's certainly lots of migrants coming into South Africa from elsewhere in Africa, but South Africa has not been particularly welcoming of migrants from Africa or from elsewhere either. So it's relatively difficult to move to South Africa. This question of relationship to South Africa is an absolutely fascinating one. And here I do see, again, some hopeful signs in a way, which again, almost push against what Shirley was pointing at as well. And that sense of attachment to South Africa seems to be stronger amongst young Jews than amongst older Jews. So again, whether that's a generational phenomenon, whether it's just a matter of age, but there does seem to be quite strong attachment amongst younger Jews towards South Africa. And this interesting phenomenon of grandparents clearly telling their grandchildren to leave, but younger Jews, again, sensing that they are part of South African society. And I think we are seeing here, and again, a holdover, a continuation, a legacy of that sense, which was very much part of the post-1994 period of a multicultural society, where there is space as never previously for South Africans for Jews to be truly equal citizens of South Africa. And I think that a lot of South Africans have actually taken that on board, that sense of participation in the society, at least amongst, not all of them, amongst some of them. And also that sense that even in Jewish day schools, these are still, yes, they are, as you correctly point out, very white spaces, but also they're very South African spaces in their own way. That one of the features of South Africans and even of South African Judaism is how is this deeper acculturation, this sort of commitment and infatuation with sports as as a shared language and a shared sort of love with other South Africans and other such things of this kind. And so, for example, where there were disputes about sport playing on Shabbat for decades within South Africa, and those who are in favor of playing sport have almost invariably won. And I think again that this is a common, as I said, common glue which South Africans, white South Africans, or Jews at South African public school at Jewish day schools continue to feel. Whether that lasts again is a very good question. That I think again, obviously immigration is not a new phenomenon in South Africa, and that sense of immigration always being an option is again must play on identity as well. That sense of commitment, but we have an alternative, and look, everyone knows someone who lives abroad. I suppose the other area we see interesting attachment to South Africa is this commitment, and from all spectrums of society, of the Jewish community, at least to speak the language of tikkun olam and contribution to South African society. Again, it's often sort of somewhat paternalistic or patronizing sense of contribution to South African society, but still there is that, to me, that does reflect the sense that of a sense of common cause with broader South African society, and sort of pride in having the president come to the national president come to events and things of this kind, that there is that still in a sense of interconnection with the society.
So I'm going to, given the time, but there seems to be interest. So I'm going to let us go for a couple more minutes. There's one question that I'm going to ask. I don't know to what extent you can speak to it, Adam, but I've received it privately and I thought it was interesting. The size of the Jewish community with its low intermarriage rate are both most alarming in genetic terms. Is this small genetic pool causing concern and or receiving attention?
Good question. What is interesting there, and again, I can't think of any discussion around exactly this specific question, but what I think that yes, it is a declining population. Yes, it's particularly in Johannesburg, phenomenon of larger families and other such things. And I think there is an awareness of the need for genetic testing, particularly since this community was a largely Litvak community, so it already came from a relatively small concentrated area in Eastern Europe and brought with it all sorts of a smaller gene pool than perhaps we would liked. But at the same time, I think there is a fair amount of even if there isn't substantial in-migration to South Africa, a number of South African, particularly those religious, but not just those religious, will often study in Israel, will for a period, or will travel and meet their spouses, and then in some cases come back to South Africa. So there is, I would hope, some fresh genes added to the gene pool. But it is an interesting question, and I now need to follow up and actually think about, has anyone thought about this, going forward within the community.
Thanks. Yes, I thought that was a fascinating question. So I'm going to ask one final question, and that is Mike's question that everyone can see in the chat, which is, what was the organized Jewish community's response? What were the responses to the survey's findings?
Oh, so interesting. So as I described to you, there was much unhappiness about particularly the population figure. That's a sense, and I suggested some of the reasons why. The community the official community prior to the survey's release was still routinely using the figure of 80,000 Jews in South Africa, which to me was even a fiction in 2005. That was the upper end of a band. And if you're the most optimistic reader of the 2005 survey, you might be able to convince yourself there were 80,000 Jews in South Africa. Realistically, there probably weren't 80,000 Jews in South Africa in 2005. So there was unhappiness about this. And quite a lot of pushback around specifically this question. Otherwise, the reality is, think about the timing of the survey, which was released. The survey report was released in March of 2020. And for good or bad, it was overtaken by COVID. In fact, we had a launch event when COVID, where COVID was suddenly on people's minds. And I think that all those it did us the favor of distracting people from other elements which they might have been very concerned about, or alternatively might have been very unhappy with. On the other hand, it has meant that the community has had pressing matters on its mind for the last number of years, particularly to trying to address this problem of an elderly population dealing with COVID. And also the economic effects of COVID on the population as well. In fact, one of the things we're trying to do now is to return to some of this data and bring it back into focus. Since at least the acute concern with COVID is now subsiding, to bring back attention to this broader picture. But what I think has happened in the interim, at least I get a sense has happened in the interim, is that that sense that the community is 50,000 strong, which was outrageous to a number of people in 2020, is no longer outrageous. That it's sort of in the interim has become it's become something which they're accepting of. But otherwise, and also again, I suppose this is typical of any sort of academic project, that the community or any community is very happy to, particularly community leaders are quite happy to ignore what they want to ignore and to celebrate what they want to celebrate. So how much our findings have penetrated is also a uncertain thing. And I should say I've answered much too long, but I'll say one final thought here. The one significant positive effect I think we have had in Cape Town is that is a project underway to plan for the future, to plan properly for the future, something called the Cape Town 2040 vision. And they've taken on board the sense that this community that held out hope prior to our survey findings that there would be lots of semigration, that the community was 20,000, not 12,500, and it was going to grow over time and all sorts of things of this kind. And I think that there's a real realism which is set in, particularly in Cape Town, in terms of needing to prepare for a community which is now 12,000 and which will grow smaller over time in terms of planning so that there isn't a crisis of the kind we've actually seen in Johannesburg.
Fascinating. Well, Adam, a huge, huge thank you on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre for making what could have been quite dull, lots of facts and figures, really immensely fascinating and engaging. Thank you for your fantastic answers to all of these questions, the wide-ranging questions. Thank you to you, our audience, for taking the time to be here, for patiently waiting as we ran a few minutes over. And Adam, I should say, I've had lots of lovely private messages as well. This has really been a terrific talk. So thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you soon. Adam, to hosting you to talk about your new book, to hosting you in 2030 to hear how this all panned out. And hope to see all of you on one of our events again sometime soon. Thanks again for joining us.
A great pleasure. Bye-bye.